Okay, finally we see smooth muscle, and smooth muscle is called smooth because we don't see the striations. We have kind of still a single nucleus. We have a spindle shape to it. These muscles are actually under involuntary or autonomic control, same as our heart. These tend to be located, these are located internally. Especially we see them in our blood vessels and in our digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive organs. And so what they're doing, they're usually moving some sort of structure from one part of an organ through an organ somewhere else. So for instance, in our digestive system, we go through a process called peristalsis, where we're squeezing the food through our alimentary canal or our whole digestive tract. Another real important thing that we talk a lot about is the fact that we can control the diameter of different structures such as our blood vessels by either relaxing these or constricting these. And that becomes very important to how we control certain things in the body, such as how we control where our blood flow is. So these things will be very important when we talk about things like our autonomic nervous system or just how the body switches from the sympathetic to parasympathetic nervous system and how the body is controlling the internal organs. Okay, our last tissue we're briefly going to hit here that's super important is our nervous tissue. And our two major types of cells in nervous tissue are, even though there are subcategories of these, but our two major types of cells are our neurons and our neuroglia cells, or glial cells sometimes they're just called. Okay, so here we see our last type of tissue, our nervous tissue, made up of different types of cells. Notice we have neurons, which is represented by the larger picture, and these are the cells that basically are receiving and sending or releasing neurotransmitters. These are the cells that make up the majority of our nervous system that is actually very active in sending impulses that actually cause the neurotransmitters to be released. Now, looking at the neuron itself, there are three main parts of a neuron, and in this picture we see the tree-like extensions coming off called dendrites, and it says in the picture contacted by other neurons. So these dendrites, their main job is to receive neurotransmitters. We'll talk about exactly what they do. So other neurons would actually make contact with the dendrites with the ends of their axons, the synaptic bulbs, and they would synapse with the dendrites so that they could release neurotransmitters to the dendrites. So bottom line is dendrites receive information. They don't send information. They don't release neurotransmitters, but they do receive the neurotransmitters, and they go through what we call a depolarization, which we'll discuss later on. Now, the next area we see is called the cell body, also referred to as the soma, and this is what contains most of the major organelles that do the jobs within the cell. And this is where we would find the nucleus and the nucleolus, and this is where a lot of the processing of the information that the cell's receiving would go on. Then we see the very last part of the cell called the axon, and the axon is where we send information. In other words, an impulse is generated called an action potential, moves down this axon, and when that impulse gets to the very end of the axon, where it synapses with either another neuron, a muscle, or a gland, then it releases the neurotransmitters, and that causes some sort of response in whatever it is synapsing with. So these are the very active portions of our nervous system. In this case, this is an example called a motor neuron, but there are different types of neurons, but they're very active, and they're receiving and sending information. Now, in order for them to be able to do their job, they have to have another type of nervous system cell called a glial cell or neuroglial cell that is a supporting cell. Normally, there's actually more neuroglial cells than there are neurons. They actually support the neurons. But they do several different jobs. There's actually different categories of the neuroglial cells, but they do several jobs. As we see here, they there's usually more of them, and they're all around the neuron, so they help maintain the actual physical structure. They can actually help repair the tissue if there is some sort of injury. We have some, they actually do some immunity jobs, like our white blood cells. They perform some phagocytosis where they're really protecting the neural tissue by engulfing any type of invader that shouldn't be there. They actually provide nutrients, so they kind of help feed and make sure, because it's very specific what the neurons have as far as their nutrition. They feed almost exclusively on glucose, so the support cells help determine and help provide that. And in determining and providing the actual nutrients to the neurons, they actually form something in the brain, at least, called the blood-brain barrier. They actually help structure the capillaries around the neural tissue, and then they're very selective on what they will allow to leave the blood to become part of the tissue or part of the nutrition or part of the interstitial fluid that surrounds the actual neuron itself. So the support cells are extremely important. Another thing I want to mention is the neurons themselves, for the most part, don't have structures in them called centrioles, which are necessary if a cell divides. The neuroglial cells, however, they do have centrioles, so they do have the ability to divide. Now, one area that this becomes extremely important in, when we talk about cancers, which is the uncontrolled division of cells, it is the glial cells that tend to become cancerous, not the neurons. Anyway, this is our last tissue, and when we get to the nervous tissue and the nervous system, we will go into great detail on the different types of cells involved and exactly what they do.